Some wounds never heal, they just learn to hide beneath the years we pile on top of them. 70-year-old Evelyn had spent 4 decades trying to forget the mountain cottage where her family disappeared. But when a mysterious deed arrived listing the abandoned place for just $5, her heart knew it was time to go home. She bought it hoping to finally find peace with the past. Instead, she found a massive wolf guarding her door. The ancient creature didn't attack her. It watched her with knowing eyes, as if it had been waiting all these years. Inside the cottage, Evelyn discovered old journals and family keepsakes that revealed a forgotten legend about a guardian beast bound to her bloodline. The wolf seemed to be protecting something precious within those walls. But what really happened the night her little sister vanished? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive up the winding mountain road felt like traveling backward through time. Each familiar curve brought another memory rushing back, memories Evelyn had spent decades trying to bury. The pine trees stood taller now, their branches intertwining overhead like protective arms, filtering the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns across the gravel path. She'd forgotten how quiet these mountains could be, how the silence seemed to hold its breath. At 70, Evelyn had grown accustomed to her orderly life in the city. Her small apartment near the library where she'd worked for 35 years was filled with books, tea sets, and the comfortable routine of a woman who'd learned to find peace in solitude. She'd never married, never had children. The few relatives who remained had long since stopped asking why she avoided family gatherings or why she'd never returned to the place where she was born. But here she was, after 4 decades, because of a piece of paper that had arrived in her mailbox 3 weeks ago. The property deed had been yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. The price listed had made her laugh out loud in her quiet kitchen. $5 for 40 acres and a 3-bedroom cottage. More of a joke than a real estate transaction. Yet something about that absurd price had stirred something deep within her chest. Something she'd thought was safely buried. The cottage came into view as she rounded the final bend, and Evelyn's hands tightened on the steering wheel. It looked smaller than her memories suggested. The wood siding weathered to a silvery grey, the stone chimney covered in decades of moss and climbing ivy. The front porch sagged slightly, and several shutters hung askew. But the bones of the house were solid, the foundation strong. Just as she remembered, it was then that she saw the wolf. The creature sat perfectly still on the front porch, as if it had been waiting for her arrival. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The beast was enormous, easily the size of a small horse, with thick dark fur that seemed to absorb the dappled sunlight. Its eyes, a startling amber color, fixed on her car with an intelligence that made her skin prickle with recognition, though she couldn't say why. For a long moment, neither moved. Evelyn sat in her car, engine still running, staring at this magnificent and terrifying guardian. The wolf stared back, unblinking, its massive head tilted slightly, as if studying her. There was no aggression in its posture, no bared teeth or raised hackles. If anything, the creature seemed curious, perhaps even welcoming. Slowly, Evelyn turned off the engine. The sudden silence felt heavy with significance. She could hear her own heartbeat, the whisper of wind through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, the soft trickle of the creek that had provided the cottage's water for over a century. The wolf didn't move as she opened her car door and stepped out onto the gravel. Up close, it was even more imposing. Its shoulders would easily reach her waist if it stood. But those amber eyes held a depth that spoke of ancient wisdom, of secrets kept and promises honored. "Hello," she whispered, feeling foolish for speaking to a wild animal, yet somehow compelled to acknowledge its presence with the respect it seemed to command. The wolf's ears twitched slightly, the only indication it had heard her. Then with fluid grace it rose to its feet and padded down the porch steps. Evelyn's muscles tensed, ready to retreat to her car, but the animal simply walked past her to the edge of the clearing and sat down again, watching, waiting. With trembling hands, Evelyn retrieved her small suitcase from the trunk and approached the cottage. The key was supposed to be under the third loose board on the porch, another detail from the mysterious paperwork that had accompanied the deed. She found it exactly where indicated, as if someone had been maintaining this simple system for 40 years. The front door opened with a groan of protest, and the scent of the interior hit her like a physical blow. Cedar wood, old wool, and something else. Something that smelled like home, like childhood, like everything she'd lost. The cottage was clean, far cleaner than an abandoned building had any right to be. No dust sheets covered the furniture, no cobwebs draped the corners. Someone, or something, had been caring for this place. The main room was exactly as she remembered it. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by built-in bookshelves that still held some of her father's hunting magazines and her mother's romance novels. The kitchen, visible through an arched doorway, looked functional, the old-fashioned pump handle at the sink polished to a soft gleam. But it was the mantelpiece that drew her attention. There, among the few remaining family photographs, sat a small porcelain music box. Evelyn's vision blurred as she approached it. The delicate ballerina figure wore a tiny pink tutu, her arms forever frozen in an elegant arabesque. This had been Sarah's most treasured possession. With shaking fingers, Evelyn wound the key on the bottom of the music box. The mechanism protested slightly after decades of silence, then began to play the haunting melody of Für Elise. The notes seemed to fill the cottage with memories of a little girl with golden curls who had danced to this tune every evening after dinner, spinning in circles until she collapsed in giggles on the braided rug. Sarah had been 8 years old when she disappeared. Evelyn had been 15, old enough to understand the gravity of what had happened, old enough to carry the guilt that perhaps she could have prevented it somehow. Their parents had vanished the same night, leaving only questions and a teenage girl who would never be the same. As the music box wound down, Evelyn became aware of a presence behind her. She turned to find the wolf standing in the doorway, its massive frame filling the entrance. But there was no menace in its stance. If anything, it looked almost sad, its great head lowered as if in sympathy. "You know about them, don't you?" she asked softly. "You know what happened to my family." The wolf's amber eyes seemed to glow in the fading afternoon light. Then, with deliberate steps, it approached the fireplace and settled itself on the hearthrug, the very spot where Sarah used to dance. The message was clear. This guardian was connected to her family's story, and it had been waiting a very long time for someone to return and listen. Outside, the mountain winds whispered through the pines, carrying voices from the past and promises yet to be fulfilled. Evelyn sank into her father's old armchair, the leather cracked but still comfortable, and studied the magnificent creature that had claimed her childhood home. Whatever had happened here 40 years ago, whatever had taken her family, this wolf held the key to understanding it all. The sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the cottage interior in shades of gold and amber that matched the wolf's watchful eyes. For the first time in 4 decades, Evelyn was home. And somehow, despite the mystery and the fear and the weight of unanswered questions, that felt exactly right. Evelyn woke to the sound of scratching. At first, she thought it might be mice or squirrels that had made themselves at home in the cottage walls during its long abandonment. But as consciousness fully returned, she realized the sound was more deliberate, more rhythmic. Someone, or something, was scratching at the front door. Dawn light filtered through the bedroom curtains, the same yellow gingham her mother had sewn when Evelyn was 12. She'd slept in her childhood bed, in the room she'd shared with Sarah, surrounded by faded wallpaper, adorned with dancing lambs and nursery rhymes. The room felt smaller now, but the comfort of familiar surroundings had given her the first peaceful night's sleep she'd had in weeks. The scratching continued, patient but insistent. Evelyn slipped on her robe and padded barefoot to the front window. The wolf sat on the porch, one massive paw raised to the door. When it saw her face in the window, it stopped scratching and tilted its head towards something on the porch boards. Cautiously, Evelyn opened the door. The wolf had retreated to the edge of the porch, but remained watchful. There, placed carefully near the doormat, lay a leather-bound journal. The cover was worn and water-stained, the binding cracked with age. Evelyn recognized it immediately. Her father's hunting journal, the one he'd carried on every expedition into these mountains. She picked up the journal with trembling hands. It felt heavier than she remembered, weighted with secrets. The wolf watched as she opened to the first page, where her father's careful handwriting documented deer movements and weather patterns from 40 years ago. But as she flipped through the pages, the entries became stranger, more urgent. October 15th, found tracks again near the sacred grove. Larger than any wolf I've seen. Native elders weren't lying about the old stories. October 18th, Margaret thinks I'm losing my mind. Maybe I am, but something's watching the girls when they play in the woods. Something with yellow eyes. October 20th, met with Joseph Crow Feather. He knows more than he's saying. Spoke about the old pact, the price our family agreed to pay. I thought those were just stories. Evelyn's hands shook as she read. Her father had never mentioned any of this, had never spoken of pacts or watching eyes. She flipped to the final entries, dated just days before the disappearance. October 25th. It's getting stronger. I can feel it in the woods, ancient and patient. Joseph says the time is coming when we'll have to honor the agreement. I won't let them take my daughters. October 26th. Found Sarah in the woods again past the creek. She says she was playing with her friend, but there was no one there when I arrived. Only those yellow eyes watching from the shadows. October 27th. Tonight. Joseph says it has to be tonight. The bloodline debt comes due on the new moon. I've hidden Evelyn in the root cellar. She must survive to continue the family line. If we don't return by dawn, she'll know we chose love over obligation. The journal slipped from Evelyn's nerveless fingers, landing with a soft thud on the porch boards. The final entry was dated October 27th, the night her family had vanished without a trace. The night she'd waited in the root cellar until morning, too terrified to emerge, until the search parties found her huddled and speechless among the winter vegetables. The wolf padded closer, its amber eyes filled with what looked remarkably like sympathy. It nudged the journal with its massive snout, then looked up at her meaningfully. There was intelligence in that gaze, a depth of understanding that sent chills down her spine. "You were there that night," she whispered. "You know what happened?" The memory came rushing back with startling clarity. She'd been 15, old enough to babysit Sarah while their parents attended a town meeting about the new logging proposals. But they'd never made it to town. Around 8 o'clock, her father had burst through the door, his face pale with terror she'd never seen before. "Evelyn, take Sarah to the root cellar. Now, don't come out until dawn, no matter what you hear. But Dad, promise me." His voice had been desperate, urgent. "Promise me you'll stay hidden until the sun rises." She'd nodded, grabbing Sarah's hand and leading her confused little sister to the cellar beneath the kitchen floor. They'd hidden among the mason jars and potato sacks, Sarah crying softly for their parents while Evelyn tried to be brave. The sounds had started around midnight. Footsteps on the floor above, voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize. Sarah had whispered about seeing yellow eyes through the cellar boards. But Evelyn had told her it was just her imagination. Then came Sarah's scream. Her little sister had suddenly bolted for the cellar stairs, moving faster than Evelyn could react. "My friend is calling me," Sarah had cried. "He needs help." Evelyn had tried to follow, but something had held her back, not physical restraint, but a compulsion so strong it felt like invisible chains. She'd sat in that cellar until dawn, as promised, listening to sounds she couldn't identify and praying for her family's return. When the search parties found her the next morning, there was no sign of her parents or Sarah. No footprints, no signs of struggle, no trace that they'd ever existed except for their belongings still scattered throughout the cottage. Now, 40 years later, she finally understood. Her father's journal revealed the truth she'd been too young to comprehend. Her family hadn't been victims of some random tragedy. They'd been participants in something far older and more complex, something that involved debts and bloodlines and creatures with yellow eyes. The wolf stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking back at her expectantly. It wanted her to follow, to see something more. Evelyn clutched the journal to her chest and stepped into her shoes. Whatever answers waited in these mountains, she was finally ready to face them. The morning air was crisp and sweet, with the scent of pine and wildflowers. The wolf led her along a path she hadn't walked in 40 years, deeper into the forest, where the trees grew so thick they blocked most of the sunlight. This was where Sarah had always wanted to play, where their parents had forbidden them to venture alone. After 20 minutes of walking, they emerged into a circular clearing dominated by an enormous oak tree. Its trunk was easily 20 feet in diameter, its branches stretching up to form a natural cathedral. The bark was carved with symbols she didn't recognize, spirals and angular shapes that seemed to shift and dance when she wasn't looking directly at them. The wolf sat beside the great tree and watched as Evelyn approached. There, at the base of the oak, she found disturbed earth. Not a grave, but something else. A place where objects had been buried and carefully concealed. She knelt and began to dig with her hands, the rich forest soil cool between her fingers. Within minutes, she uncovered something that made her heart stop: her mother's wedding ring, still gleaming despite 4 decades in the earth. As she held the ring up to the filtered sunlight, more memories surfaced. Her parents hadn't just vanished. They'd made a choice, a sacrifice to protect something. But what? And why had she been spared when the rest of her family was taken? The wolf's low whine drew her attention back to the present. It was looking toward the tree, its ears alert to some sound she couldn't hear. Then she saw it, carved into the bark at eye level, almost hidden among the ancient symbols. 2 words in her father's careful handwriting: "Forgive us." Whatever pact her family had been bound to, whatever debt they'd been forced to pay, they'd faced it with love and courage. They'd hidden her away not out of favoritism, but because someone had to survive to continue the bloodline, to carry the family's burden forward. The wolf rose and began walking back toward the cottage, leaving Evelyn alone with her discoveries. As she followed the path home, clutching her mother's ring and her father's journal, she realized her peaceful retirement was over. She'd come here seeking closure, but instead she'd found a responsibility she'd never known existed. The cottage looked different as they emerged from the forest. Not just a childhood home anymore, but a guardian post, a place where ancient promises were kept and family obligations honored. The wolf settled itself on the porch as Evelyn climbed the steps, its amber eyes reflecting depths of knowledge she was only beginning to understand. She had a choice to make. She could return to her quiet city life, pretend she'd never found the journal or the ring, and let whatever force had claimed her family claim her as well when her time came. Or she could stay and learn the truth about the bloodline debt, about the creature that watched over these mountains, and about the price her family had been willing to pay for love. Looking into the wolf's ancient, knowing eyes, Evelyn realized there was really no choice at all. The town library hadn't changed much in 40 years. The same heavy oak tables dominated the main reading room. The same musty smell of old paper and binding glue filled the air. And Mrs. Henderson still presided over the circulation desk like a benevolent guardian of knowledge. She was older now, her silver hair completely white, but her sharp blue eyes lit up with recognition when Evelyn walked through the front doors. "Evelyn Thornfield," she said, rising from her chair with surprising agility for a woman who had to be pushing 90. "I wondered if you'd ever come back." "Hello, Mrs. Henderson. I'm surprised you remember me." "Child, I remember every patron who ever set foot in my library. Besides, you had quite the appetite for our local history section, as I recall." Her expression grew more serious. "I heard you bought the cottage back. That must have been difficult." Evelyn nodded, not trusting her voice. "Word traveled fast in small mountain towns, apparently. I'm hoping to learn more about my family's history. Things my parents never told me." Mrs. Henderson's eyes grew thoughtful. "The Thornfields have deep roots in these mountains, deeper than most people realize. Come with me. I have some materials you might find illuminating." She led Evelyn to a small archival room behind the main library, unlocking the door with an old-fashioned brass key. The room was lined with filing cabinets and storage boxes, meticulously labeled in Mrs. Henderson's precise handwriting. "I've been the keeper of this town's memory for 60 years, Mrs. Henderson said, pulling out a thick folder marked Thornfield Family Genealogical Records. "Some stories aren't meant for casual browsing, but you have a right to know your own heritage." The folder contained documents Evelyn had never seen, birth certificates, land deeds, and newspaper clippings dating back to the 1880s. As she read, a disturbing pattern emerged. Thornfield family members had been disappearing for generations, always during new moon periods, always leaving behind children who carried on the family name. Her great-great-grandmother, Elizabeth Thornfield, had vanished in 1923, leaving behind twin daughters. Great-grandmother Rose had disappeared in 1943, leaving Evelyn's grandmother, Margaret. The pattern was consistent and chilling. One generation would sacrifice themselves, ensuring the next generation could continue the bloodline. "Mrs. Henderson," Evelyn said slowly, "did you know about this pattern when I was a child?" The elderly librarian's expression grew sad. "I suspected. My grandmother was part Cherokee, and she told me stories about the old agreements between families and the spirits of these mountains. I thought they were just legends until your family disappeared." "What kind of agreements?" "Protection pacts, mostly. A family would offer service to a guardian spirit in exchange for the spirit's protection over their bloodline and the surrounding area. But such agreements always came with a price, usually paid in blood or years of service." Evelyn's hands trembled as she continued reading. One document caught her attention, a handwritten letter from her grandmother to the previous librarian, dated just months before her own disappearance. "Dear Catherine, if anything happens to me, please ensure my granddaughter Evelyn never learns the truth about our family's obligation. Let her live freely in the outside world, far from these mountains and their ancient hungers. The burden has already claimed too many Thornfield women. Perhaps it will be satisfied with my sacrifice and leave the children in peace. I pray I am not condemning my daughter Margaret to the same fate, but the pact requires continuation of the bloodline. Someone must survive to bear the next generation, even if they never understand why. With regret and love, Rose Thornfield." "She knew," Evelyn whispered. "My grandmother knew what was going to happen to her." Mrs. Henderson nodded gravely. "The older generation understood things the younger ones were protected from. It was considered a kindness to let children grow up without the weight of destiny on their shoulders." The next document made Evelyn's blood run cold. It was a deed transfer signed by her grandmother and witnessed by someone named Joseph Crow Feather. The deed granted spiritual guardianship of the Thornfield lands to the Ancient One, keeper of the forest's heart, in perpetuity for the protection of bloodline and territory. "Joseph Crow Feather," Evelyn said. "My father mentioned that name in his journal. Joseph's family has lived in these mountains longer than anyone can remember. His grandfather was present when your great-great-grandmother signed the original pact. If anyone can tell you the whole truth, it's Joseph." Mrs. Henderson provided directions to Joseph's cabin, located deep in the forest on the far side of the mountain. As Evelyn prepared to leave, the librarian pressed something small and cool into her hand. "This belonged to your grandmother. She left it with me before she disappeared, with instructions to give it to you if you ever returned." Evelyn looked down at a delicate silver locket, tarnished with age, but still beautiful. Inside, she found a pressed flower, wolf's bane according to the tiny label written in her grandmother's careful script, and a small photograph. The woman in the picture looked exactly like Evelyn, down to the same hazel eyes and determined chin. "She knew I'd come back," Evelyn said, wonder in her voice. "The women in your family have always been strong and stubborn. Your grandmother believed that eventually the call of these mountains would bring you home." The drive to Joseph Crow Feather's cabin took her deeper into the forest than she'd ever ventured. The road became little more than 2 tire tracks through the trees, and more than once she wondered if she'd taken a wrong turn. But just as the sun began to set, She spotted smoke rising through the canopy and followed it to a modest log cabin nestled in a grove of ancient pines. Joseph Crowfeather was waiting for her on his front porch, as if he'd known she was coming. He was a man of perhaps 75, with long silver hair braided down his back and intelligent dark eyes that reminded her of the wolf's amber gaze. His weathered hands were wrapped around a steaming mug of tea, and he gestured for her to take the chair beside him. "You have your grandmother's look about you," he said without preamble. "Rose was a good woman, brave to the end. You knew her." "I know all the Thornfield women. My family has been bound to yours for 4 generations now. Guardians of the guardians, you might say." He studied her face carefully. "You've met the wolf. It wasn't a question." Evelyn nodded. "He's been at the cottage since I arrived. He brought me my father's journal. That's because it's time. The pact has been dormant too long, and darkness is stirring in the deep woods. Things that should stay buried are beginning to wake." Joseph set down his mug and walked to the edge of his porch, gesturing for Evelyn to follow. In the distance, she could see the cottage's chimney smoke rising above the treetops. Between Joseph's cabin and her family's land, the forest seemed darker somehow, as if shadows moved independently of the trees that cast them. The wolf, his true name is Fenris, has been waiting 40 years for a Thornfield to return. He's getting old and his strength is failing. Without a proper anchor to the bloodline, he can't maintain the barriers that keep the old evils contained. What kind of evils? Joseph's expression grew grim. Things that hunger for more than flesh and blood. Spirits that feed on despair and darkness. Creatures that would turn these peaceful mountains into a wasteland of nightmares. Your ancestors made a deal to keep them sealed away, but that deal requires regular renewal. Evelyn felt the weight of the silver locket against her chest, the pressed wolfsbane flower her grandmother had left as a message. The pattern was becoming clear. Each generation had faced this choice, this moment when the old responsibilities demanded attention. "What happened to my family, Joseph? What really happened that night?" The old man's eyes filled with sadness. They chose love over duty. Instead of offering themselves to renew the pact, they tried to break it entirely. They thought if they all disappeared together, the wolf would be freed from his obligations, and you could live a normal life. But it didn't work. Ancient magic doesn't break easily. It bends, it waits, but it doesn't simply fade away. Your family's sacrifice bought you 40 years of freedom, but now the debt has come due again. As darkness settled over the forest, Evelyn heard sounds that made her skin crawl, distant howls that didn't sound quite like wolves, rustling in the underbrush that suggested movement far larger than any natural forest creature. The protection her family had died to maintain was failing, and she was the only one left who could renew it. The weight of generations pressed down on her shoulders as she sat beside Joseph on his porch, watching shadows dance between the trees. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to honor the pact her ancestors had made or let it crumble entirely. Tonight, she would try to understand what that choice really meant. Back at the cottage, Evelyn found Fenris waiting on the porch, with something clutched gently in his massive jaws. As she approached, he dropped it at her feet, a small piece of paper, yellowed and brittle with age. When she unfolded it carefully, she gasped. It was a child's drawing, done in crayon with the unmistakable enthusiastic strokes of an 8-year-old. The scene depicted a little girl with golden curls, playing with an enormous wolf in a sunny meadow. Both figures were smiling, and at the bottom, in Sarah's careful printing, were the words, "Me and my forest friend." Evelyn's legs gave out, and she sank onto the porch steps, clutching the drawing to her chest. All those times Sarah had claimed to have a friend in the woods, all those moments when their parents had gently scolded her for telling stories, Sarah had been telling the truth. She'd known Fenris, had played with him, had formed the kind of bond that only children could create with creatures adults feared to understand. "Where did you find this?" she whispered to the wolf. Fenris tilted his great head toward the forest, then padded down the porch steps and began walking toward the trees. His message was clear: follow me. Evelyn tucked the drawing safely into her jacket pocket and did as he requested. He led her to the creek that ran behind the cottage, to a spot where the water pooled into a natural swimming hole surrounded by smooth rocks. This had been Sarah's favorite place to play. She'd spent hours here building fairy houses from twigs and stones, always chattering about her invisible friend who watched over the forest creatures. Fenris nosed at a particular rock near the water's edge, whining softly. When Evelyn looked closer, she realized it wasn't just a rock. It was a carefully constructed cairn, a memorial of sorts. Beneath the top stone, she found more of Sarah's artwork, preserved in a makeshift waterproof container. Each drawing told the same story. Sarah playing with her wolf friend, Sarah riding on his back through moonlit forests, Sarah and the wolf standing together beneath the great oak tree, both of them looking up at something bright and beautiful in the sky. In the final drawing, Sarah was holding the wolf's paw, while strange dark shapes lurked at the edges of the forest. The wolf stood between Sarah and the shadows, protecting her. These weren't just the innocent fantasies of a lonely child. They were records of a friendship, documentation of trust between a little girl and an ancient guardian. Sarah had known Fenris was real, had understood his purpose, even when the adults around her dismissed her stories as imagination. As Evelyn studied the drawings, she noticed that Fenris himself had changed. Where she'd first seen a magnificent but wild creature, she now observed signs of weariness. His movements were slightly stiff, his breathing sometimes labored. When he settled beside her at the creek, she noticed grey threading through his dark fur and a cloudiness in his amber eyes that spoke of advancing age. "You're tired," she said softly, reaching out to touch his massive head. He allowed the contact, leaning into her palm with a sound that was part whine, part sigh. "You've been alone too long." That evening, Evelyn called her cousin Margaret in Seattle, the only remaining family member who might remember anything about the old stories. Margaret was 10 years older than Evelyn and had left the mountains for college just before the disappearances occurred. "Evelyn, my God, I haven't heard from you in years. Are you all right?" "I'm at the cottage, Margaret." I brought it back. A long silence. Then, "Oh, honey, why would you do that to yourself?" "Because I need to understand what happened to my family. Did your mother ever tell you stories about our bloodline? About any kind of obligation or pact?" Another pause, this one filled with the rustle of papers and the sound of Margaret settling into a chair. "She mentioned some things, but I always thought they were just old superstitions. Mountain folklore, you know? She used to say our family had a special responsibility to the land, that we were guardians of something important." "What kind of guardians?" "I'm not sure. She was always vague about the details. But she did say that every generation had to choose between duty and freedom, and that the choice would define not just our own fate, but the fate of everyone in the valley." Margaret's voice grew softer, more hesitant. "Evelyn, there's something else. After your family disappeared, I found some papers in my mother's things. Letters from your grandmother, documents I didn't understand. I've kept them all these years, thinking someday I might make sense of them. Can you send them to me? I can do better than that. I can bring them. I've been wanting to see the old place again anyway, and frankly, I'm worried about you being there alone." They arranged for Margaret to visit the following weekend, giving Evelyn time to process what she'd already discovered. That night, she made a decision that surprised her. She left the cottage door open and waited to see what would happen. Around midnight, she was awakened by the soft pad of enormous paws on the wooden floor. Fenris stood beside her bed, watching her with those ancient eyes. When she didn't protest, he lay down on the braided rug beside the bed, his presence both protective and comforting. For the first time since returning to the cottage, Evelyn's dreams were peaceful. She dreamed of running through moonlit forests alongside a massive wolf, her bare feet silent on the forest floor, her heart filled with a wild joy she'd never experienced in waking life. In her dreams, she understood the language of wind through pine needles, could sense the heartbeat of the mountain itself. She woke to find Fenris gone, but evidence of his presence everywhere. A wildflower on her pillow, smooth river stones arranged in a spiral on the kitchen table, pine cones stacked into a small pyramid by the fireplace. Each offering was placed with care, with intention, as if he were trying to tell her something important. The pattern continued over the next few days. Each morning brought new gifts: a perfect hawk feather, a piece of quartz that caught the sunlight like a prism, berries arranged in the shape of a heart. Fenris was courting her trust the way he'd once courted Sarah's friendship, building a bridge between the world of humans and the ancient forces that governed these mountains. Evelyn found herself responding in kind. She left food for him, not dog food, but the kind of offerings that seemed appropriate for a supernatural guardian. Fresh salmon from the market in town, honey from the local beekeeper, wild berries she gathered herself from the forest. Each gift disappeared by morning, replaced by something new from Fenris. As the week progressed, she noticed other changes in the forest around the cottage. Birds sang more sweetly in the mornings. The air smelled cleaner, charged with an energy that made her skin tingle. Even the cottage itself seemed to be responding to the renewed connection. Doors opened more easily, windows let in more light, and the old pump in the kitchen began producing the sweetest water she'd ever tasted. But with the positive changes came ominous signs as well. Strange shadows moved at the edge of her vision. She heard sounds in the night that didn't belong to any natural creature: scraping, whispering, and occasionally something that sounded almost like laughter. The darkness beyond the cottage's protective circle was growing bolder, testing the boundaries of Fenris's weakening power. On Thursday night, Evelyn woke to find Fenris standing at her bedroom window, his hackles raised and a low growl rumbling in his chest. Beyond the glass, she could see shapes moving between the trees, tall, angular forms that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. They moved with unnatural fluidity, testing the invisible barriers that surrounded the cottage. Fenris turned to look at her, and in his amber eyes she saw not just exhaustion, but desperation. He was fighting a losing battle against forces that grew stronger while he grew weaker. The gifts he brought her weren't just tokens of friendship. They were pleas for help, requests for the partnership that had once existed between her family and the guardian of these mountains. As she watched the dark shapes retreat into the forest depths, Evelyn understood that her time for decision-making was running out. Whatever choice she made about the family pact, she would have to make it soon. The balance that had protected these mountains for generations was failing, and she was the only one who could restore it or let it fall entirely. The weight of her ancestors' sacrifices pressed down on her as she lay in bed, listening to Fenris's protective patrol around the cottage. Tomorrow, Margaret would arrive with more pieces of the puzzle. By the weekend, Evelyn would have to decide whether to honor the ancient agreement that had claimed so many Thornfield women, or break the cycle once and for all and face whatever consequences followed. Margaret arrived Friday afternoon in a rental car loaded with boxes and an expression of barely contained worry. At 65, she was still striking, silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, sharp blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the confident bearing of a woman who had spent 30 years as a federal judge. But when she stepped out of the car and saw the cottage, her composure cracked. "It looks exactly the same," she whispered. "I expected it to be ruins by now." Evelyn embraced her cousin, feeling the tension in Margaret's shoulders. "Someone or something has been taking care of it." As if summoned by their conversation, Fenris emerged from the forest. Margaret gasped, stepping behind Evelyn instinctively. The wolf was an impressive sight, even at a distance, his massive frame and amber eyes commanding respect and caution. "That's the largest wolf I've ever seen," Margaret breathed. "That's Fenris. He's the guardian I told you about on the phone." Margaret studied the creature with the analytical eye of someone accustomed to evaluating evidence. "He's watching us, but not aggressively. It's almost like he's assessing whether I'm a threat to you. He's very protective. Come on, let's get your things inside, and you can show me what you brought." The cottage's interior seemed to welcome Margaret despite her obvious nervousness. She moved through the rooms like someone walking through a museum of memory, touching surfaces and sighing at familiar objects that had somehow survived 4 decades of abandonment. I still can't believe how well preserved everything is, she said, running her fingers along the kitchen counter. It's as if time stopped the night they disappeared. That evening, they spread Margaret's documents across the dining room table. The collection was extensive: letters, photographs, official documents, and what appeared to be pages from an old journal written in multiple hands over several generations. The most significant discovery was a formal treaty document, yellowed with age, but still legible. The header read, "Agreement between the Thornfield bloodline and the keepers of the sacred grove," and was dated 1889. "My great-great-grandmother signed this," Evelyn said, tracing the faded signature with her finger. Margaret adjusted her glasses and read aloud. "In exchange for protection of our family line and dominion over the mountain territory, we pledge eternal guardianship of the sacred grove and allegiance to Fenris, the ancient guardian, through blood bond and sacred trust." The document outlined specific obligations. Each generation would provide an anchor, a family member who would serve as the earthly connection between Fenris and the human world. In return, Fenris would protect the bloodline from supernatural threats and maintain the barriers that kept darker entities sealed beneath the mountain. "This isn't just about our family," Margaret said, her voice growing grave. "Look at this clause about territorial protection. If the pact fails, the entire region becomes vulnerable to what they call the ancient hunger, entities that feed on fear and despair." Evelyn studied the treaty's final page, which contained warnings written in her great-great-grandmother's careful script. Should the bloodline fail to provide an anchor for 3 consecutive lunar cycles, the sacred grove will open and release what was sealed within. The Guardian's power will fade, and the darkness will spread until it consumes all life in the valley. 3 lunar cycles, Evelyn murmured. "It's been almost 3 months since I returned. How long since my family disappeared?" Margaret consulted a calendar she'd brought, counting backward. "If they vanished on October 27th and you returned in late January, that's exactly 40 years and 3 months. The deadline may have already passed." As if responding to their conversation, Fenris appeared at the front door. Through the window they could see him pacing restlessly, occasionally looking toward the deeper forest with obvious agitation. "He's worried about something," Evelyn observed. Margaret gathered the documents carefully. "According to these papers, there should be instructions for renewal of the pact. Let me see if I can find them." She pulled out another folder, this one containing pages that looked much older than the others. The writing was in multiple languages: English, what appeared to be Cherokee, and symbols that didn't belong to any alphabet either woman recognized. "Here," Margaret said, pointing to a page with English translations written in the margins. "The renewal ceremony. It has to be performed during the new moon at the sacred grove. That's the oak tree you described, isn't it?" Evelyn nodded, reading over her cousin's shoulder. "The ceremony required the voluntary participation of a blood descendant, the presence of the guardian, and something called the witness, presumably someone like Joseph Crow Feather who understood the ancient agreements." "Margaret," Evelyn said slowly, "what do you know about the other families who've made similar pacts?" "What do you mean?" "Joseph mentioned that his family has been guardians of the guardians for generations. That suggests we're not the only ones involved in supernatural agreements." Margaret rifled through the documents until she found what she was looking for, a map of the region with various properties marked in different colors. The Thornfield land was marked in blue, but there were other areas marked in red, green, and yellow. According to this, there are 4 guardian territories in this mountain range. Each family is responsible for maintaining the seal on different types of supernatural threats. She traced the boundaries with her finger. "The Thornfields guard against the ancient hunger. The Crow Feathers protect against shadow walkers. The Blackwood family, I remember them. They prevent something called the Sleepers from awakening. And the 4th family?" Margaret's expression darkened. "The Whitehorse family. They were responsible for containing what the map calls the Bone Collectors, but their territory is marked with an X and the notation Pact Broken, 1962. A chill ran down Evelyn's spine. What happened in 1962? I'm not sure, but if I remember correctly, that was the year we had those strange disappearances in the northern part of the valley. Entire families would vanish overnight, leaving behind only skeletal remains. Through the window, they could see Fenris had stopped pacing. He stood perfectly still, his head tilted toward the forest, as if listening to something beyond human hearing. Then he turned toward the cottage and released a howl that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. Margaret grabbed Evelyn's arm. "What was that about?" Before Evelyn could answer, they heard it, an answering call from deep in the forest. But this wasn't the howl of a wolf. It was something else entirely, something that made their teeth ache and their skin crawl with primordial fear. "The other guardians," Evelyn whispered. "They're calling to each other." As if to confirm her words, two more howls echoed across the valley, each with a distinctly different tone and timbre. The supernatural guardians of the four territories were communicating, and their message was clear. Something was wrong, something that required their immediate attention. Fenris bounded up onto the porch and began scratching at the door with urgent intensity. When Evelyn opened it, he pushed past her into the cottage and went directly to the dining room table where the documents were spread. He placed one massive paw on the map, directly over the X that marked the White Horse territory. "He wants us to understand something about the broken pact," Margaret said, her voice tight with fear. As they studied the map more closely, Evelyn noticed something that made her blood run cold. The White Horse territory bordered the sacred grove. If the bone collectors had been freed from their prison in 1962, they'd had over 60 years to grow stronger and spread their influence. And now, with the Thornfield Pact failing as well, there would be nothing to stop them from claiming the entire mountain range. The weight of responsibility settled on Evelyn's shoulders like a physical burden. This wasn't just about honoring her family's memory or understanding their sacrifice. The entire region depended on the ancient agreements being maintained, and she was the only one left who could renew the most crucial pact of all. Outside, the unnatural howls continued, creating a symphony of supernatural distress that spoke of barriers failing and ancient evils stirring in the depths of the mountain. Time was running out, and the choice that had seemed personal and manageable just hours before had become a matter of life and death for everyone in the valley. The supernatural distress calls continued through the night, keeping both women awake despite their exhaustion. By dawn, Fenris was visibly deteriorating. His amber eyes had grown cloudy, and he moved with obvious pain. When Evelyn offered him food, he barely sniffed at it before returning to his vigil by the window. "He's dying," Margaret said quietly, observing the great wolf from the kitchen doorway. "Whatever's happening in the forest, it's draining his strength." Evelyn knelt beside Fenris, running her hands through his thick fur. She could feel his labored breathing, the tremor in his muscles that spoke of a creature fighting against time itself. "How long do we have?" Margaret consulted the documents they'd spread across every available surface. "According to the renewal ceremony instructions, it has to be performed during the new moon. That's tomorrow night, and if we miss it, the pact becomes void permanently. The sacred grove opens, and whatever's been sealed inside is freed to ravage the valley." A knock at the front door interrupted their grim planning. Joseph Crowfeather stood on the porch, but he wasn't alone. Behind him were two other Native American elders, a woman with steel-gray braids and fierce dark eyes, and a younger man whose bearing suggested both authority and deep worry. "This is Elena Blackwood and Marcus Standing Bear," Joseph said without preamble. "Elena's family guards against the sleepers. Marcus represents the northern territories, since the White Horse line was broken." Elena stepped forward, her weathered hands clasped tightly. "We felt the disturbance last night. The barriers are failing faster than we anticipated." Marcus nodded grimly. "The bone collectors have been testing the boundaries for months. With your family's pact weakening, they're growing bold. What exactly are these bone collectors?" Evelyn asked, dreading the answer. "Ancient spirits that devour life force," Elena explained. They leave behind only dried husks, empty bones picked clean of everything that made them human. In 1962, the last White Horse heir chose love over duty. He refused the pact to marry a woman from the city. Within 6 months, 17 families in the northern valley had been consumed. Joseph gestured toward the forest, where an unnatural mist was beginning to gather despite the clear morning sky. The collectors sense weakness. They know the Thornfield Guardian is failing, and they're preparing to breach the Sacred Grove's defenses. Margaret had been listening intently, her judicial mind processing the implications. Is there no way to restore the White Horse Pact? Surely someone in that bloodline survived. Marcus shook his head sadly. The line ended in 1979 when the last descendant died childless. We've been holding their territory through shared guardianship, but it's a temporary solution at best. Elena moved to the window where Fenris lay panting. Your guardian is suffering because he's trying to maintain barriers meant to be shared among 4 protectors. The strain is killing him. Then we need to perform the renewal ceremony tonight, Evelyn said, though her voice shook with uncertainty. There's a complication, Joseph said gently. The ceremony requires the voluntary sacrifice of a blood descendant. Not death necessarily, but a binding that will tie you to this land and its guardian for the rest of your life. You would become Fenris's anchor, unable to leave these mountains for more than a few days, without weakening the protective barriers. Margaret reached for Evelyn's hand. That's what happened to all the other women, isn't it? They didn't die, they became prisoners of the pact. Not prisoners, Elena corrected softly. Partners, guardians. The relationship between human and spirit protector is sacred, but it requires complete commitment. Half measures lead to failure and death. As they spoke, the mist in the forest grew thicker, and shapes began moving within it. Tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to glide rather than walk. Even at a distance, their presence felt like ice water in Evelyn's veins. We need to move the ceremony to tonight, Marcus said urgently. The new moon isn't until tomorrow, but the barriers won't hold that long. Joseph shook his head. The timing must be precise. New moon ceremonies draw power from the absence of lunar influence, when the veil between worlds is thinnest. If we attempt it too early, the binding won't hold. Evelyn watched the approaching figures in the mist and made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Then we need to buy time. Is there a way to strengthen the barriers temporarily? Elena and Joseph exchanged glances. There is, Elena said slowly, but it requires significant personal sacrifice from the guardian candidate. A blood offering to reinforce the Sacred Grove's defenses. What kind of blood offering? Your life force, channeled through the Grove's root system. It would keep the barriers strong until the new moon ceremony, but it would also bind you partially to the pact. If the full ceremony fails for any reason, you would be trapped between worlds, neither fully human nor fully spirit. Margaret gripped Evelyn's hand tighter. There has to be another way, but Evelyn was already moving toward the door. Fenris struggled to his feet and followed her, his steps unsteady but determined. If I don't do something, the bone collectors will break through today and kill everyone in the valley. At least this gives us a chance. The group made their way to the Sacred Grove, Fenris leaning heavily against Evelyn for support. The ancient oak tree seemed darker than before, its carved symbols glowing faintly with an inner light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The mist was closer now, and within it, the bone collectors circled like predators testing a fence. Joseph directed Evelyn to place her palms against the oak's trunk. The bark felt warm, almost alive, and she could sense the vast network of roots spreading deep into the mountain's heart. Elena began chanting in a language that predated European settlement, while Marcus kept watch for approaching threats. Think of your connection to this land, Joseph instructed. Remember your childhood here, your love for your family, your willingness to protect what matters most. Evelyn closed her eyes and let the memories flow. Sarah's laughter echoing through the cottage, her parents' quiet contentment in their mountain home, the peace she'd found in these forests before tragedy struck. As the emotions intensified, she felt something responding from deep within the earth. The tree's symbols blazed brighter, and a surge of energy flowed through Evelyn's hands into the root system. She gasped as her life force was drawn into the network, strengthening barriers that had protected this valley for over a century. The sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying. She could feel herself becoming part of something vast and ancient. The mist recoiled as if struck, and the bone collector's frustrated shrieks echoed across the valley. The barriers were holding, but Evelyn could feel the drain on her own vitality. She was now tied to the sacred grove, her life force feeding its defenses until the full ceremony could be completed. As they returned to the cottage, Margaret supported Evelyn's weakened steps. "How do you feel?" "Different," Evelyn admitted. "I can sense things I couldn't before. The heartbeat of the mountain, the flow of underground streams, the presence of every living creature in the forest. But I also feel like I'm being pulled in two directions, caught between what I was and what I might become." Fenris pressed against her side, offering his warmth and strength. The temporary reinforcement had helped him as well. His breathing was easier, his eyes clearer. But they all knew this was just a reprieve. Tomorrow night would bring the moment of final choice, when Evelyn would have to decide whether to fully embrace the ancient pact or watch everything she'd come to love crumble into darkness. The bone collectors continued their restless prowling at the edge of the valley, held back by barriers powered by her own life force. Every hour that passed drained her a little more, making tomorrow's ceremony both more necessary and more dangerous. She was walking a razor's edge between salvation and destruction, with the fate of an entire community balanced on her decision. That evening, as Evelyn rested and tried to conserve her energy for the next night's ceremony, Fenris began behaving strangely. He paced restlessly around the cottage, whining and scratching at doors that led to rooms Evelyn hadn't fully explored. His agitation was so pronounced that Margaret finally suggested they follow him to see what he wanted. The wolf led them to a small storage room behind the kitchen that Evelyn had assumed was just a pantry. But Fenris pushed past the shelves of preserved goods and began clawing at what appeared to be a solid wall. On closer inspection, they realized it was actually a cleverly concealed door. "There's a hidden room," Margaret said, running her hands along the wall's edges. "Look, here's the latch." The concealed door opened to reveal a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Fenris bounded ahead, his eagerness overriding his recent weakness. Evelyn and Margaret followed cautiously, using Margaret's phone as a flashlight. The stairs led to a small underground chamber that had clearly been used as a shelter or safe room. But it wasn't empty. Against one wall stood a child-sized bed made up with familiar quilts. A small table held books, paper, and crayons. And carved into the stone wall were dozens of pictures. Crude but unmistakable depictions of a little girl playing with a massive wolf. "Someone's been living down here," Margaret whispered. Evelyn approached the table with trembling hands. Among the art supplies, she found a diary bound in soft leather. The cover was inscribed with a name that made her heart stop. Sarah Thornfield. She opened the diary with shaking fingers. The first entry was dated just 3 months ago. Written in handwriting that had matured from a child's careful printing to an adult's flowing script, but was unmistakably her sister's. January 15th, Fenris says Evelyn is coming home soon. I can hardly believe it's been 40 years since I've seen her face. I wonder if she'll recognize me, or if the years have changed us both too much. I've grown up here in the space between worlds, aging slowly under Fenris's protection, but I'm still her little sister in so many ways. Evelyn's legs gave out, and she sank onto the small bed. "Sarah," she whispered. "Oh my God, Sarah's alive." Margaret read over her shoulder as Evelyn flipped through the diary entries. The truth that emerged was both wonderful and heartbreaking. Sarah hadn't died that night 40 years ago. She'd been taken into Fenris's protection when she agreed to serve as the guardian's anchor in Evelyn's place. January 20th. I made the right choice that night, even though it meant giving up the life I might have had. Evelyn was always the stronger one, the one meant for the outside world. I was happy here in the forests with Fenris, even as a child. Taking her place in the pact felt natural, like coming home. February the 2nd. The years have been kind in their own way. I've learned things no human should know. The language of trees, the songs of underground streams, the ancient wisdom that flows through the mountain's heart. I've watched over our family's territory and kept the barriers strong. But I've been so lonely. February 10th. Fenris grows weaker each day. The pact was meant to be renewed every generation, not maintained indefinitely by one person. I've given everything I have to keep the barriers intact, but it's not enough anymore. The dark things grow bold, and I fear what will happen if Evelyn doesn't return soon. Margaret found a lamp and turned it on, illuminating the rest of the chamber. It was clear that Sarah had lived here for decades, creating an underground home filled with the artifacts of a life spent in service to forces beyond human understanding. Books on botany and geology sat alongside volumes of Native American folklore and supernatural history. Pressed flowers and healing herbs hung in careful bundles from the ceiling, but the most striking discovery was a collection of paintings covering an entire wall. These weren't the crude drawings of a child, but sophisticated artwork depicting the hidden life of the mountains. Sarah had painted the other guardians, a magnificent black wolf that must be Elena's protector, a great eagle with eyes like stars, and something that looked like living shadow with silver eyes. At the center of the painted mural was a scene that took Evelyn's breath away. It showed two women standing hand in hand at the sacred grove, one with silver hair and lined face, the other young and golden-haired. Between them stood Fenris, not weakened by age, but restored to his full supernatural glory. "She's been waiting for you," Margaret said softly. "All this time she's been waiting for you to come home so you could share the burden." Evelyn continued reading the diary, tears streaming down her face. "March 1st, I can feel Evelyn's presence growing stronger. She's in the cottage now, learning about our family's true history. Part of me wants to reveal myself, but I know she needs to understand the choice fully before we're reunited. The pact isn't about sacrifice, it's about partnership. Fenris and I have been incomplete all these years, waiting for the missing half of our guardian bond." March 5th. The ceremony is tomorrow night. I've prepared everything, the ritual space, the offerings, the words that will bind us all together properly. For the first time in 40 years, I feel hope. Soon, Evelyn and I will be together again, and the ancient protections will be renewed. The valley will be safe, and we'll finally be the family we were meant to be. The final entry was dated that very day, March 15th. Tonight, everything changes. I can hardly contain my excitement. After 4 decades of separation, my sister and I will be reunited. Not in the world above, where time and distance keep us apart, but in the sacred space between worlds where guardians dwell. Fenris will be restored, the barriers will hold, and our family's long sacrifice will finally have meaning. Evelyn closed the diary and looked around the chamber with new eyes. This wasn't a prison or a hiding place. It was a sanctuary where her sister had grown into something more than human. A bridge between the mortal world and the ancient forces that protected it. She chose this, Evelyn said, wonder in her voice. Not as a sacrifice, but as her calling. Fenris padded over to a corner of the chamber and nosed at something hidden behind a curtain. When Evelyn pulled the fabric aside, she found a mirror, but not an ordinary one. The glass seemed to shimmer with inner light, and as she stared into it, another face appeared beside her reflection. Sarah looked exactly as she had at age 8, but her eyes held the wisdom of someone who had spent 40 years learning the deepest secrets of the natural world. She smiled and her hand pressed against the glass from the other side. "Hello, Evelyn." Sarah's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, carried on air that smelled of pine and wildflowers. "I've missed you so much." Evelyn pressed her own hand against the mirror, tears flowing freely. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I should have known, should have come back sooner. You came back exactly when you were supposed to." Tomorrow night, we'll perform the ceremony together. The pact was never meant to burden just one person. It was designed for sisters, for family, for love shared between the human world and the guardian realm. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and Sarah's image began to fade. Rest now, sister. Tomorrow we'll be together again, and this time, neither of us will have to bear the responsibility alone. As the vision faded, Evelyn understood that everything she'd learned about her family's fate had been only half the truth. They hadn't died or disappeared. They'd transformed, becoming something greater than human, to protect what they loved most. And now she had the chance to join them, not as a sacrifice, but as a willing partner in an ancient and sacred trust. The revelation changed everything about tomorrow's ceremony. Instead of facing a grim choice between duty and freedom, she was being offered the chance to reunite with her beloved sister and become part of something magnificent and eternal. The fear that had plagued her for days transformed into anticipation. Tomorrow night, the Thornfield sisters would stand together again, and the mountains would have their guardians restored. The discovery of Sarah's survival transformed the cottage overnight. What had been a place of mourning became a sanctuary of preparation and hope. Margaret threw herself into organizing the ritual materials with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex cases, while Evelyn spent the morning in Sarah's underground chamber, reading through decades of accumulated wisdom about the Guardian Pact. Joseph, Elena, and Marcus arrived before dawn, carrying bundles of sacred herbs and mysterious objects wrapped in soft leather. The three elders moved with the purposeful gravity of people who understood they were participating in something that happened perhaps once in a generation. The ceremony requires specific preparation, Joseph explained as they arranged materials in the cottage's main room. Both sisters must be cleansed and blessed before they can enter the sacred space together. Eleanor unwrapped a collection of items that looked more like art than ritual tools. Carved bone pipes, crystals that seemed to hold inner fire, and small clay vessels filled with pigments that shifted color as the light changed. These have been prepared by my family for such an occasion. The paints will mark you as bridge walkers, those who can move between the human world and the spirit realm. Evelyn studied the materials with fascination and growing nervousness. What exactly will happen during the ceremony? Sarah's diary mentioned partnership, but what does that mean in practical terms? Marcus consulted a scroll covered in symbols and text in multiple languages. According to the ancient instructions, the ceremony creates a three-way bond between the two human anchors, between the humans and the guardian spirit, and between all three and the sacred land itself. You and Sarah will share the responsibility that has been weighing on her alone for 40 years. But I'll still be able to live in the human world? Yes, but changed, Elena said gently. You'll be able to sense things others cannot, supernatural threats, the health of the forest, the needs of the guardian, and you'll be bound to return here regularly to renew your connection to the land. Think of it as having two homes instead of one. As the day progressed, Evelyn noticed that Fenris was growing stronger in anticipation of the evening ceremony. His eyes were clearer, his movements more fluid, and several times she caught him looking toward the hidden chamber, as if he could sense Sarah's presence growing stronger. Margaret had thrown herself into documenting everything, taking photographs of the ritual materials and copying text from the ancient scrolls. Someone should keep a record of this, she explained when Evelyn questioned her thoroughness. If something goes wrong, future generations will need to understand what happened here. The thought of something going wrong sent a chill through Evelyn. Joseph, what are the risks? What could happen if the ceremony fails? The elderly man's expression grew grave. Failure could mean several things. In the best case, the current barriers would continue to weaken until they collapsed entirely, freeing the bone collectors and other sealed threats. In the worst case, attempting to force a bond that isn't meant to be could tear holes between the worlds. creating permanent gateways for things that should never touch our reality. And what happens if I'm not strong enough to maintain my part of the bond? The ceremony will test your true commitment, Elena answered. The spirits can sense hesitation, fear, or selfish motivation. The bond only forms when all participants are acting from pure love. Love for family, love for the land, love for all the lives that depend on the Guardian's protection. As afternoon faded into evening, strange phenomena began manifesting around the cottage. Flowers bloomed out of season, their petals glowing faintly in the twilight. Birds that should have been asleep gathered in the trees around the sacred grove, singing songs that sounded almost like human voices. The air itself seemed charged with potential, crackling with energy that made their skin tingle. Most remarkably, the barrier between worlds began to thin. Through the cottage windows, they caught glimpses of figures that weren't quite there, translucent forms moving through the forest, and occasionally a flash of golden hair as Sarah prepared for the ceremony from her side of reality. "She's getting ready too," Evelyn whispered, watching her sister's ghostly form arrange items around the sacred grove. "She's as nervous as I am." Elena began the preparation ritual as the sun set completely. Using the shifting pigments, she painted intricate designs on Evelyn's hands and face, spirals that seemed to move on their own, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, and symbols that felt ancient beyond human memory. "These marks will allow you to enter the sacred space," Elena explained as she worked. "They'll also protect you if something goes wrong during the crossing." Joseph prepared Fenris for his role in the ceremony, braiding small bones and feathers into his fur and painting his claws with a silver substance that gleamed like starlight. The great wolf submitted to the decoration with dignity, occasionally glancing toward the forest as if he too could sense Sarah's approaching presence. Margaret helped. Evelyn changed into the ceremonial clothing Elena had brought, a simple white dress made from fabric that felt like moonlight and moved like water. It was similar to dresses worn by Native American women during spiritual ceremonies, but with modifications specific to the Guardian tradition. "You look like a bride," Margaret said softly, adjusting the dress's flowing sleeves. "In a way, I suppose I am," Evelyn replied. "I'm marrying myself to this land, to its guardian, to responsibilities I'm only beginning to understand." As midnight approached, the supernatural activity around the cottage intensified. The bone collectors had retreated to the valley's edges, held back by the temporary barriers Evelyn had reinforced. But their frustrated howls echoed across the mountains. Other sounds joined them, the calls of the remaining guardians as they prepared to witness and support the ceremony. "It's time," Joseph announced, consulting a pocket watch that seemed to tick in rhythm with some cosmic heartbeat. "The new moon is at its peak. The veil between worlds is as thin as it will ever be." They processed toward the sacred grove by lamplight, Fenris leading the way with newfound strength and purpose. The ancient oak tree was transformed. Every carved symbol blazed with silver fire, and the air around it shimmered like heat waves. But these weren't waves of temperature. They were waves of reality itself, bending and flowing as two worlds prepared to touch. As they entered the grove's sacred circle, Evelyn saw her sister clearly for the first time in 40 years. Sarah stood on the opposite side of the great tree, no longer translucent, but fully present. She had grown into a beautiful woman, her childhood features refined by years of wisdom and purpose. Her golden hair was longer now, woven with flowers and small bones that marked her as a guardian. Her eyes held depths that spoke of conversations with spirits and knowledge of secrets the modern world had forgotten. "Hello, Evelyn," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the distance between them. "You're more beautiful than I ever imagined you'd become." Tears streamed down Evelyn's face as she took in the sight of her sister, alive and radiant, with supernatural purpose. "Sarah, I've missed you every day for 40 years. I know. I've watched over you when I could, sent you dreams of peace when the nightmares grew too strong. But tonight, we'll never have to be separated again." Fenris moved to the center of the grove, positioning himself between the two sisters. His transformation was remarkable. Age and weariness fell away like shed skin, revealing the magnificent creature he truly was. His fur gleamed silver in the supernatural light, his amber eyes blazed like stars, and his very presence commanded reverence from every living thing in the forest. Joseph stepped forward, with the scroll containing the ceremony's words, while Elena and Marcus took positions at the cardinal directions around the tree. Margaret remained at the grove's edge, serving as witness and protector should anything threaten the ritual. "Sisters of the Thornfield bloodline," Joseph began, his voice taking on the resonance of someone speaking words that had been spoken for generations. "Do you come willingly to renew the ancient pact? Do you offer yourselves as anchors for the guardian spirit, as protectors of the sacred trust, as bridges between the world of humanity and the realm of spirits?" Evelyn looked across at Sarah, drawing strength from her sister's serene confidence. Together, they spoke the words that would bind them to something greater than themselves. "We come willingly, with love for our family, our land, and all who depend on our protection." The ceremony was about to begin, and with it, a transformation that would echo through the mountains for generations to come. The sacred grove responded to their declaration as if the very earth had been waiting to hear those words. The carved symbols on the ancient oak flared brighter, and the ground beneath their feet began to pulse with a rhythm that matched their heartbeats. Joseph raised his arms, and in his hands appeared an object none of them had seen him carrying, a golden eagle feather that seemed to contain its own source of light. "This feather has guided guardian ceremonies for over 2 centuries, Joseph announced, his voice carrying the weight of ancestral authority. "It serves as the bridge between worlds, the pathway that will allow both sisters to enter the sacred space together." Elena began a chant in the Cherokee language, her voice weaving harmonies that seemed to call other voices from the forest itself. The trees around the grove swayed without wind, their branches reaching toward the ceremony like arms raised in blessing. Marcus added his voice in a different native tongue, creating a symphony of ancient words that resonated in their bones. The feather in Joseph's hands began to glow more intensely, and suddenly the air between Evelyn and Sarah shimmered like water. The barrier that had separated them for 40 years was dissolving, replaced by something that felt like stepping into a warm embrace. "Take the first step," Joseph instructed. "Trust in the bond that has never truly been broken." Evelyn lifted her foot and discovered that the ground beneath it had changed. Instead of forest soil, she stepped onto something that felt like moonlight made solid, warm, soft, and alive, with gentle energy. Sarah stepped forward at the same moment, and suddenly they were walking toward each other across a space that existed between the human world and the spirit realm. As they moved closer, Evelyn could see that her sister had been marked by her 40 years of guardianship in beautiful ways. Small silver scars formed intricate patterns on her hands and arms, not wounds, but ritual markings that told the story of her service. Her eyes held flecks of amber that matched Fenris's gaze, and when she smiled, there was wisdom there that spoke of conversations with ancient spirits and knowledge of the mountain's deepest secrets. "You've grown so beautiful," Evelyn whispered as they drew within arm's reach of each other. "So have you," Sarah replied. "I can see the strength in you now, the courage that brought you back to us when we needed you most." They reached for each other at the same moment, and when their hands touched, the grove exploded with silver light. Energy flowed between them, 40 years of separation compressed into an instant of perfect connection. Evelyn felt Sarah's memories flooding into her mind, decades of communion with forest spirits. The weight of maintaining barriers single-handedly, the loneliness of loving from a distance, and underneath it all, an unshakable faith that someday her sister would return. In return, Sarah experienced Evelyn's memories, the guilt and loss that had shaped her life, the quiet years of service in the city library, the careful isolation that had protected her from forming attachments that might be broken, and finally, the courage that had brought her back to face the truth about their family's destiny. Fenris approached them, his supernatural glory now fully revealed. He was enormous, larger than any earthly wolf could be, and his presence radiated ancient power and wisdom. But when he looked at them, his eyes held the same gentle affection they'd seen when he was weakened and aging. "My faithful guardians," he spoke, his voice resonating inside their minds rather than their ears. "For 40 years I have waited for this moment when the sisterhood could be restored. Sarah has served with honor and love, bearing a burden meant to be shared. Evelyn has returned not from duty alone, but from the love that binds families across time and distance." The great wolf padded closer, and both sisters reached out to touch his silver fur. The moment their hands made contact with him, the final barrier dissolved entirely. They were no longer standing in a forest grove. They were standing in the heart of the mountain itself, in a space that existed outside normal reality. Here, the sacred grove was revealed in its true form. The oak tree was not just a tree, but a living tower of light that stretched from the earth's core to the heavens. Its roots were rivers of silver energy that connected every living thing in the valley, while its branches held stars like fruit. Around them, the landscape pulsed with the rhythm of some vast heartbeat, the mountain's own life force, ancient beyond human comprehension. "This is what we protect," Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder even after 40 years of guardianship. "Not just the forest or the valley, but the very heart of life itself." Evelyn stared in amazement at the beauty surrounding them. Rivers of light flowed through the air like aurora, carrying messages between different realms of existence. Spirits of every kind moved through the landscape, some that had once been human, others that had never known mortal form, all of them part of the great web of life that the Guardians were sworn to protect. Joseph's voice reached them across the dimensional barriers, guiding them through the ritual's next phase. "Place your hands upon the Tree of Hearts. Let your life force join with its ancient power. Speak the words that will bind you to each other and to the sacred trust." The sisters approached the transformed tree together, Fenris walking between them. When they placed their palms against its living light, they felt the pulse of every creature in the valley, deer in the meadows, eagles soaring above the peaks, fish in the mountain streams and deeper down. The slow thoughts of the mountain itself. "We pledge our lives to the protection of this sacred trust," they spoke in unison, the words coming from some deep knowledge they shared. "We offer ourselves as anchors between the worlds, as guardians of the barriers that keep darkness at bay, as sisters bound by love to serve something greater than ourselves." The tree's light flowed into them, through them, around them, creating connections that would last for the rest of their lives. But this wasn't the draining sensation Evelyn had experienced during the temporary barrier reinforcement. This was energizing, transformative, like being filled with liquid starlight. As the light of the Tree of Hearts flowed through them, Evelyn and Sarah began to understand the true nature of their shared destiny. They weren't just renewing an old agreement. They were becoming something new, something that had never existed before in the history of the Guardian Pacts. "Two anchors," Fenris's voice resonated through their consciousness, filled with wonder. "Never before has the sacred trust been maintained by sisters who chose this path together. The power you can channel, the protection you can provide, will be unlike anything these mountains have ever known." Suddenly, the peaceful ceremony was interrupted by a sound that chilled them to their bones, a roar of rage and hunger that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. In the distance, darkness gathered at the edges of their sacred space, pressing against barriers that were already straining. "The Bone Collectors," Sarah said grimly. "They know what we're doing. They're trying to break through before the ceremony can be completed." Through their connection to the Tree of Hearts, they could sense the ancient evil testing every weakness in the valley's defenses. The creatures had grown stronger during the decades when the barriers had been maintained by a single guardian. And now they sensed their last chance to break free before the protections were renewed and strengthened. "We have to finish the ceremony," Evelyn said, though fear made her voice tremble. "If we stop now, everything Sarah has sacrificed will be lost." Fenris moved to position himself between the sisters and the approaching darkness. His form began to change, growing larger and more magnificent as the power of the renewed pact flowed into him. "Continue the ritual. I will hold them back." The great wolf bounded toward the edge of their sacred space, where shadow creatures with eyes like burning coals were trying to claw their way into the Tree of Hearts sanctuary. His howl of challenge echoed across dimensions, calling the other guardians to his aid. From the north came Elena's protector, a massive black wolf whose fur seemed to absorb light itself. From the east arrived a golden eagle whose wingspan blocked out stars, its eyes blazing with ancient fire. Even from the broken White Horse territory came a response. Not a guardian, for that line had been severed, but the spirits of all the family members who had died maintaining that particular seal. They manifested as a pack of translucent wolves, their ghostly forms still bound by love to protect the valley they had served in life. The ceremony. Joseph's voice reached them urgently across the dimensional barriers. "You must complete the binding before the bone collectors realize they cannot break through by force." Sarah grasped Evelyn's hands as they stood before the Tree of Hearts. "Together," she said, "we speak the final words together." But as they prepared to complete the ritual, something unexpected happened. From the base of the tree, a crystalline formation began to emerge, a structure that seemed to be made of compressed memories and shared experiences. As it grew, they realized it contained every moment of love and connection between their family members, stretching back generations. "The memory crystal," Sarah breathed. "It's forming because we're doing this together. Because our bond is strong enough to create something new." The crystal pulsed with warm light, and suddenly they could see and feel everything. Their parents' last moments as they chose to sacrifice themselves rather than abandon their children. Their grandparents' quiet courage as they faced their own ceremonial transformations. And stretching back through time, every Thornfield who had served as guardian, connected by love across the centuries. "We are not the first," Evelyn realized, tears streaming down her face. "But we're the first to face this choice as sisters who truly understand what we're choosing. We are the first to transform the curse into a blessing," Sarah added. "The first to prove that love shared makes us stronger than love sacrificed." Together, they spoke the final words of the ceremony. "By blood and choice, by love and sacrifice, by the bonds that death cannot break and time cannot weaken, we bind ourselves to this sacred trust. Let our lives be the bridge between worlds, our love the foundation of protection, our sisterhood the source of strength that will endure until the mountains themselves crumble into dust." The Tree of Hearts blazed with light so intense it seemed to illuminate every corner of existence. The memory crystal resonated like a bell, its harmonic tones spreading across the valley and beyond, carrying news of the renewed pact to every corner of the supernatural world. In that moment of completion, the bone collectors' assault faltered. The darkness that had pressed against their sacred space recoiled as if burned, and the creature's frustrated shrieks faded into the distance. The barriers were not just renewed, they were transformed, strengthened by the unprecedented bond between two sisters who had chosen their destiny with full knowledge and willing hearts. But the ceremony wasn't finished. As the immediate threat receded, Evelyn and Sarah found themselves facing a choice they hadn't anticipated. The memory crystal offered them a gift. They could remain together in the sacred space, serving as eternal guardians who never aged and never died, or they could return to the human world as anchors who would live normal lifespans while maintaining their supernatural responsibilities. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, her hand still warm in Evelyn's grasp. Evelyn looked around at the beauty of the sacred space, then back toward the human world where Margaret waited anxiously for their return. "I want to live," she said softly. I want to experience both worlds, the magical and the mundane. I want to grow old with you and watch the seasons change and help others understand what we've learned." Sarah smiled, and in her expression was the same adventurous spirit that had made her eager to explore the forest as a child. "Then that's what we'll do. We'll be guardians who live in the world instead of apart from it. We'll show others that duty and joy can coexist." As they made their choice, the sacred space began to fade around them, returning them gently to the human world. But they carried its light within them now, and they would always be able to return when the mountains needed their direct intervention. They were bridges between worlds, living proof that love could transform any burden into a privilege. 1 year later, Evelyn stood on the cottage porch, watching her sister tend the garden they'd planted together that spring. Sarah moved through the rows of vegetables and herbs with the same grace she'd always possessed. But now there was a new vitality to her movements, a joy that came from living fully in both the human and spirit worlds. The cottage had been transformed into something that bridged both realms. The main floors served as a comfortable home, where the sisters could live normal lives, entertaining visitors like Margaret, who came regularly to document their ongoing discoveries. But the hidden chamber beneath had been expanded into a proper sanctuary, a place where they could commune with Fenris and monitor the supernatural protections that kept the valley safe. The garden itself was a testament to their new role. Ordinary vegetables grew alongside plants that existed only in the spaces between worlds. Moonflowers that bloomed with actual silver light. Herbs that could heal both physical injuries and spiritual wounds. And a small grove of saplings that were offspring of the sacred oak itself. Margaret emerged from the cottage carrying a tea tray, her legal mind still fascinated by the documentation project that had become her retirement passion. She'd published several academic papers on folklore preservation, carefully disguising the truth as cultural anthropology, while ensuring that future generations would have access to the real history if they knew how to read between the lines. "Any supernatural visitors today?" Margaret asked, settling into one of the rocking chairs they'd added to the porch. "3 hikers who'd gotten lost in the deep woods," Sarah replied, wiping soil from her hands. "The forest spirits guided them to our doorstep. We gave them hot soup and directions back to the main trail." This had become a regular occurrence. The cottage served as an unofficial rescue station for people who wandered too far into the protected areas. And the sisters had developed a reputation as knowledgeable locals who always seemed to appear when travelers needed help. "And the barriers?" Margaret continued, her systematic approach to information gathering unchanged, despite the magical nature of their work. "Stronger than they've been in decades," Evelyn answered, settling into her own chair. "Having 2 anchors has allowed us to reinforce protections that had been weakening for generations. Joseph says the other guardian families are reporting similar improvements. Our renewal ceremony seems to have strengthened the entire network." Fenris padded around the corner of the cottage, no longer the ancient, weary creature they'd first encountered. The ceremony had restored him to his prime, and he now moved with the fluid power of a supernatural force in perfect balance. He'd grown comfortable with domestic life, often spending evenings on the porch with them, occasionally offering insights about forest management or supernatural threats in his direct, telepathic communication style. "There's something else," Sarah said, a mysterious smile playing at her lips. "Show her, Evelyn." Evelyn reached into her pocket and pulled out a letter that had arrived that morning, delivered not by the postal service, but by a golden eagle that had perched briefly on their mailbox before flying away. The envelope was addressed in elegant handwriting to the Thornfield Guardians. "It's from a young woman named Emma Whitehorse," Evelyn explained as Margaret read over her shoulder. "She's a great-niece of the last Whitehorse Guardian. She's been having dreams about the mountains, visions of the broken protective barriers in the Northern Territory." Margaret's eyes widened. "She wants to restore her family's pact." "She wants to learn," Sarah corrected. She's asking if we'll teach her what we've learned about being guardians who live in both worlds. Apparently other broken bloodlines are experiencing similar awakenings. Young people who feel called to restore their family's supernatural responsibilities. The letter was followed by several others from different parts of the country. The renewal ceremony's success had sent ripples through the spiritual realm, awakening dormant connections and inspiring a new generation of potential guardians. Instead of the old pattern of reluctant sacrifice, these young people were approaching their heritage with curiosity and enthusiasm. "We're going to start a school," Evelyn said, excitement evident in her voice. "Not a formal institution, but a place where people with guardian heritage can come to learn about their gifts and responsibilities. We'll teach them how to maintain the balance between ordinary life and supernatural duty." The idea felt perfect, a way to honor their ancestors' sacrifices while ensuring that future generations wouldn't have to face the burden of guardianship alone and uninformed. The cottage would become a center of learning, a place where ancient wisdom could be preserved and adapted for modern times. Joseph Crow Feather arrived as the sun began to set, carrying a bundle wrapped in soft leather. At 80, he moved more slowly than before, but his eyes remained sharp and his smile was warm as he greeted his former students who had become colleagues and friends. "I brought you something," he said, unwrapping his bundle to reveal a beautifully crafted document. The new family compact, written by all 4 guardian families working together. It incorporates everything we've learned from your successful ceremony. The document was a work of art, as much as a legal agreement. Hand-lettered on paper made from bark and plant fibers. It outlined a new approach to supernatural guardianship that emphasized cooperation, education, and the integration of ancient responsibilities with modern life. "Emma Whitehorse will sign this when she completes her training," Joseph explained. "And there are others. A Blackwood cousin from Oregon, a young man who claims Cherokee heritage through his grandmother's line. The network is rebuilding itself, stronger and more connected than it's been in centuries." As darkness settled over the mountains, the supernatural activity that had once seemed threatening now felt protective and welcoming. Lights danced through the forest, spirits going about their peaceful business, secure in the knowledge that the barriers were strong and the guardians were vigilant. Evelyn and Sarah sat together on the porch swing their father had built decades ago, watching the familiar dance of light and shadow that marked their territory's borders. Margaret had retired to the guest room they'd prepared for her extended visits, and Joseph was settling into the comfortable chair by the fireplace where he often spent the night when supernatural matters required discussion. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked softly. "Giving up your quiet life in the city?" Evelyn considered the question seriously. Her apartment in the city sat empty now, her position at the library filled by a young man who shared her passion for preserving local histories. Her old life felt like something that had belonged to someone else, a woman who hadn't yet understood her true purpose. "Never," she said finally. "This is what I was always meant to do. I just needed to find my way home to understand that." Sarah leaned against her sister's shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, 2 women who had found their calling in the space between worlds. In the distance, Fenris howled, not in distress, but in pure joy, celebrating another successful day of guardianship. The cottage glowed with warm lamplight. The garden rustled with the whispered conversations of helpful spirits. And the mountains themselves seemed to breathe more easily, knowing that the ancient protections were secure for another generation. Their story had begun with a mysterious deed and a $5 cottage. It had become something far more valuable, a testament to the power of love, choice, and the courage to embrace a destiny that transcended the ordinary world. The Thornfield sisters had found their way home, and in doing so, they had ensured that home would remain safe for all who needed its protection. Above them, stars wheeled in patterns that spoke of ancient promises kept and new ones yet to be made. The mountains had their guardians. The guardians had each other, and the future stretched ahead, filled with possibilities as bright as the silver light that danced eternally in the sacred grove's heart.